February 2019. BioWare ships a game it had spent 7 years building. By summer, most of the players are gone. By 2021, EA shuts it down for good. This is the story of Anthem, and how the studio behind Mass Effect lost an entire decade of momentum in a single launch window. Built by BioWare and backed by EA's considerable resources, Anthem promised something ambitious: seamless flight through dynamic environments, meaningful co-op loot progression, and a living sci-fi world that would evolve with its players over years to come. Filled with cutting-edge technology, Anthem was supposed to be their next masterpiece. Within weeks of launch, the Anthem subreddit filled with refund threads. Within months, concurrent player counts cratered. Twitch streams emptied. The loading screens became a meme, players timing them as proof of how broken the experience felt. What was supposed to be a 10-year roadmap was already losing its first quarter, and BioWare had nothing ready to ship in its place. Here's the strange part. Anthem wasn't some indie studio's failed experiment. BioWare had 3 of the most successful RPG franchises of the previous decade behind them, and EA's full financial backing in front, which raises the question every postmortem keeps coming back to. How does a studio with that resume ship a game this broken? To answer that, you have to go back to 2012. A small team inside BioWare starts prototyping what will eventually become Anthem. It doesn't have a name. It doesn't have a genre. It barely has a concept. What it has is something the studio has come to rely on. An internal term for trusting last-minute brilliance over disciplined planning. They call it BioWare Magic, and that faith will define the next 7 years. Development reportedly began in 2012, shortly after Mass Effect 3's launch. Internally, the project carried the codename Project Dylan, and with it came enormous expectations. BioWare was at a crossroads, searching for its next defining franchise, one that could anchor the studio's future for years to come. At the time, BioWare was one of the most trusted studios in gaming. The studio had built its reputation on narrative depth and player agency. From Knights of the Old Republic to Mass Effect to Dragon Age, BioWare had proven it could create worlds where characters felt real and player choices carried genuine weight. This trust was currency. It was also expectation. But behind closed doors, the team reportedly struggled for years to answer a basic question. What exactly was this game supposed to be? Was it a looter-shooter? A narrative experience? A competitive multiplayer game? Without clear direction from leadership, developers found themselves constantly pivoting, rebuilding systems that were never meant to last, chasing a vision that kept shifting beneath their feet. Core systems were redesigned from scratch. Features that had taken months to build were torn apart and rebuilt. Entire game directions, some representing years of work, were completely abandoned. Then, in June 2017, Anthem arrived on the E3 stage, and it looked extraordinary. The demo was polished, confident, and precisely what the industry needed to see. A bold vision from a studio players still trusted. Players watched squads soar through dense jungles in Javelin exosuits, shifting seamlessly between flight and combat. The demo showcased what few games had attempted: verticality and mobility that felt natural, responsive, and genuinely fun. For those watching, it was a promise of freedom. For many viewers, it became one of the standout reveals of the event. Anthem looked like Iron Man meets Destiny, built by BioWare. The combination was irresistible, a studio known for storytelling and character depth, applying that expertise to a shared world shooter. In that moment, on that stage, Anthem didn't just look promising, it looked inevitable. EA reinforced the dream with a 10-year vision, a living world that would evolve through seasonal content, co-op adventures designed to keep players returning for years, meaningful storytelling woven throughout, the kind of narrative depth BioWare had built its reputation on. It was a roadmap for a decade of engagement. Behind the scenes, the real work was only just beginning. According to Jason Schreier's reporting at Kotaku, the team hadn't seriously started building Anthem until late 2016, barely 2 years before its scheduled launch. The prior 4 years had been spent restarting, rebuilding, and rescoping. With February 2019 locked in, BioWare had less than 2 years to actually deliver a live service game from a foundation that didn't exist yet. The Frostbite engine, built primarily for first-person shooters, added further complications. Adapting it for Anthem's flight mechanics and open environments slowed progress considerably and intensified production pressure on an already strained timeline. Inside BioWare, the working theory had a name: BioWare Magic. The idea that whatever wasn't built yet would somehow come together in the final months. It had worked for Mass Effect. It had worked for Dragon Age. For more than a decade, it had been the studio's quiet superpower. But Anthem was a live service game on an engine that wasn't designed for it. And on that scale, Magic isn't a development plan. It's a prayer. Even Anthem's defining mechanic almost disappeared entirely. Flight was reportedly removed and reintroduced multiple times during development, as leadership debated whether it could be properly balanced alongside combat. The mechanic that would become the game's most celebrated feature hung in constant uncertainty. Originally expected in late 2018, Anthem slipped into early 2019. Demo periods finally gave players their first hands-on experience. These early access windows were meant to build momentum before launch. Instead, they became the first public glimpse of the problems lurking beneath the surface. What players found wasn't reassuring. Server instability plagued matchmaking. Loading screens stretched on indefinitely. Crashes interrupted sessions without warning. The technical foundation that should have supported Anthem's ambitious vision was cracking before release. Early access launched on February 15, 2019, giving players their first sustained glimpse at the finished product. The full release followed just 1 week later, leaving little time for BioWare to address the issues players encountered. For a brief moment, it looked as though Anthem might still succeed. The flying felt incredible, responsive, exhilarating, with a sense of momentum and freedom that few games had captured. The combat had real weight too, each weapon firing with satisfying feedback. In those early hours, players experienced flashes of the game BioWare had promised, but mechanics alone couldn't sustain the vision. Underneath the flight, everything else fell apart. The story was thin. Fort Tarsis, the game's hub town, asked players to walk slowly through the same corridors and listen to the same NPCs, repeat the same lines. Missions devolved into wave-clearing corridors. The loot system rewarded grinding instead of skill. And the endgame, meant to sustain players for years, was effectively over within weeks of launch. Online discussions shifted rapidly across forums and social media. Loading screens became jokes. Players timed them, memed them, questioned why they lasted so long. And the now infamous loot cave became a symbol of player frustration, an exploit that revealed just how broken the endgame truly was. Review scores reflected the disappointment. Critics praised the flying and combat, but condemned the thin narrative, repetitive missions, and anemic endgame. yet millions still purchased Anthem anyway, driven by hope that BioWare could salvage what remained beneath the surface. In 2020, BioWare announced plans for a major reinvention, a comprehensive overhaul that would address years of player feedback. The community embraced the initiative with cautious optimism, dubbing it Anthem Next or Anthem 2.0. For the first time since launch, there was tangible hope that the game might finally become what it was meant to be. There was still hope. Players weren't asking Anthem to disappear. They wanted it to become what they'd been promised. The community remained engaged, discussing potential fixes and improvements. For many, the core experience held enough promise that redemption felt possible if BioWare would commit the resources to deliver it. Then on February 24, 2021, BioWare announced it would stop new development on Anthem. The studio would redirect resources toward Dragon Age and Mass Effect. Anthem Next, the promised reinvention, was officially cancelled. For players who'd waited, hoped, and stayed invested, it was the final confirmation that their second chance would never arrive. Developers were reassigned to other projects: Dragon Age, The Veilguard, and the next Mass Effect installment. The resources that might have saved Anthem were redirected elsewhere. The comeback never came. Today, Anthem is remembered as a failure, but not because every part of it failed. Its flight mechanics were genuinely exceptional, responsive, intuitive, and exhilarating in ways few games had achieved. The combat system showed real weight and feedback. These elements suggested that somewhere within the troubled development, talented designers had created something genuinely special. But brilliance in isolation couldn't sustain a game built on promises of so much more. Anthem became a textbook case, exactly what happens when ambition outruns preparation. 7 years of shifting goals, a studio betting on last-minute magic, an engine fighting every new feature, and below it all, a team that got less than 2 years to actually build the game they were supposed to ship. Talent can't outrun structural chaos. It can only delay the bill. It also raised difficult questions about preservation. Because Anthem required online connectivity, its servers couldn't simply remain dormant. When EA eventually decided to shut them down, the entire experience became inaccessible. Players couldn't revisit Fort Tarsis, couldn't fly through Bastion, couldn't experience what remained of the game they'd invested in. It vanished entirely. Anthem still matters because nearly every studio after it has run into the same wall. Live service games demand a kind of discipline that traditional atelier studios were never built to provide. The engines that can power a battlefield can't necessarily power a shared open world. 10-year roadmaps are easy to promise in a keynote and almost impossible to deliver in code. The industry didn't stop making anthems after Anthem. It just kept paying the tuition. For all its flaws, Anthem occasionally showed players exactly what it could have been. Players experienced fragments of the promise, fleeting reminders of what BioWare had envisioned before everything else fell away. For Anthem, the final save never came.